The storm had swallowed the world in white, erasing every landmark, every road, every trace of hope. A soldier pushed through the blizzard, calling into the endless snow, but the wind only howled back. Then he noticed them, paw prints. Fresh. Steady. Leading into the storm. He followed with his heart pounding, praying the shepherd wasn't chasing ghosts. And at the end of those tracks, half buried in snow, lay a tiny hand reaching out. The storm had turned the world into a graveyard of white. Wind screamed through the empty streets, tearing shingles from roofs and burying cars in drifts taller than men. Trees bent beneath the weight of ice, their branches snapping with gunshot cracks that vanished into the howl. Daniel pushed forward anyway, his scarf frozen stiff against his face, his breath a cloud that disappeared before his eyes. His legs burned with each step, boots sinking knee-deep into powder, but he never slowed. He couldn't. Not while a child was missing out here. Emily. The name alone was enough to keep him moving. She couldn't have been more than 7, lost when her family's car spun off the road hours ago. Search parties had combed the main highway, but the blizzard swallowed everything: tracks, voices, hope. Daniel had seen storms overseas, had marched through deserts that seared his lungs, jungles that clung to his skin. But this was different. This was a silence that wanted to erase life itself. Beside him padded Shadow, his German shepherd. Snow clung to the dog's coat, his fur matted with ice, but his body moved with relentless precision. His nose pressed low to the ground, weaving back and forth, searching. Daniel's eyes never left him. Shadow wasn't just his partner, he was his compass in a world that no longer had direction. "Find her, boy," Daniel murmured, voice hoarse from the cold. "Don't stop." For long minutes, there was nothing. Just the white void, the shriek of the wind, the ache in Daniel's bones. Then Shadow stopped dead. Daniel froze. The shepherd stood perfectly still, ears pricked, tail stiff. Then, with a low growl, he pressed his nose into the snow. His paws scraped at the surface, clearing powder away until, there. A single indentation. A footprint. Small. Daniel's breath caught. His chest tightened with sudden, painful hope. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow aside. More footprints emerged, tiny, staggered, leading away from the wreckage site. The storm hadn't buried them completely yet. "Emily," Daniel whispered. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted forward along the trail. Daniel pushed himself up, legs screaming in protest, and followed. The prints wound through the white wasteland, half erased but still visible, each one a plea not to stop. But the storm wasn't giving up its prize easily. The wind howled louder, blowing fresh snow over the tracks. Daniel's heart pounded as he stumbled forward, afraid every step would be the last one he could see. Shadow didn't falter. His paws moved with certainty, his nose cutting through the storm, his body a dark beacon in the endless white. Whenever the prints vanished, Shadow barked furiously, circling until he found them again, his determination unyielding. Daniel's throat burned. "Good boy. Lead me to her." Minutes blurred into eternity. The storm fought to erase the trail faster than they could follow it, but Shadow refused to let go. Each paw print he uncovered was a heartbeat, a lifeline, a whisper that Emily was still out there, still moving, still waiting to be found. Finally, as the wind screamed and the world spun in white, Shadow stopped again. This time, he barked once, loud, sharp, commanding. His body stiffened, ears forward, tail high. Daniel stumbled to his side, eyes narrowing. Ahead, barely visible beneath a mound of snow, was something out of place. A shape too small to be a log, too fragile to be stone. A sleeve. Daniel's chest clenched. His pulse thundered in his ears as he dropped to his knees, clawing at the snow with his bare hands. Shadow joined him, digging furiously, snow spraying in every direction. And then, he saw it. A small hand, pale against the ice, fingers curled as if still reaching for someone to hold. Daniel's breath broke. Emily. Shadow whined low, pressing his nose against the hand, his tail thumping weakly despite the storm. The soldier swallowed hard, his body trembling. They had found her. Now they had to bring her back. Daniel's hands clawed through the snow until his nails split and his knuckles bled. Shadow dug beside him, throwing up white sprays with desperate sweeps of his paws. Slowly, the small body began to emerge, a girl bundled in a too-thin coat, her face half buried, lips pale, lashes frozen with ice. Emily, Daniel whispered, voice raw. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, his heart hammering. For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly, a pulse. Weak, but there. She's alive, he breathed, his chest flooding with both relief and fear. We're not too late. Shadow whined softly, leaning in to lick the girl's cheek. His warm breath steamed against her icy skin, a small act of defiance against the storm. But Daniel knew they were far from safe. The cold wasn't just around them, it was inside her, burrowing deeper with every second. Hypothermia didn't forgive delays. Daniel stripped off his gloves, ignoring the sting of the air on his raw skin, and pulled Emily into his arms. Her body was limp, her head lolling against his chest. He wrapped her in his coat, sealing her against his own heat. Stay with me, kid, he muttered, his lips pressed to her frozen hair. I've seen worse storms than you. Shadow barked once, circling them, his body tense. The shepherd knew time was their enemy now. Daniel rose, clutching Emily tight, but the world spun with white fury. The blizzard howled, erasing all sense of direction. The footprints they'd followed were already gone. Which way, boy? Daniel shouted over the wind. Shadow lowered his head, sniffing the storm, his ears twitching. Then he bolted to the left, barking furiously. His paws churned the snow, carving a path through the void. Daniel followed, stumbling, clutching Emily as if she were the only thing keeping him alive. His breath burned, his ribs ached, but he forced one step after another. The storm slammed into him like a wall, trying to knock him down, trying to bury them together in its endless white grave. Shadow didn't falter. Every few yards, he stopped, barking, checking behind him, his eyes glowing with fierce determination. Minutes blurred into agony. Daniel's legs shook, his arms numb, but he never loosened his grip. Emily's shallow breaths tickled weakly against his chest, fading with every second. No, Daniel growled, his voice breaking. Not like this. You don't quit, and neither do I. He dropped to his knees, shifting Emily so her face was close to Shadow's warmth. Keep her awake, boy. Shadow whined, pressing his nose against her cheek, licking the frost from her lashes. His body curled around hers, shielding her from the wind. Daniel pressed his own chest tighter, wrapping them both in his arms. Listen to me, Emily, Daniel said, his breath hot against her ear. You're not alone. You've got me. You've got him. You hang on. You fight. The girl's lips trembled faintly, a ghost of sound slipping free, cold. Daniel nearly wept at the word. She was still there. Still fighting. Yeah, he whispered fiercely. It's cold. But you're tougher. You hear me? Tougher. Shadow barked once, as if agreeing, his tail thumping weakly against the snow. They couldn't stay still. Daniel rose again, Emily bundled against him, Shadow leading. Through the storm, he spotted faint outlines, trees bending beneath the ice. Shelter. Not much, but better than open ground. Go, boy. Shadow bounded ahead, guiding them beneath the skeletal branches. The wind still howled, but the trees broke its teeth, giving them a pocket of stillness. Daniel lowered Emily to the ground gently, stripping off his own pack. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were emergency flares, a thermal blanket, and a single ration of heat packs. He worked quickly, snapping the packs and tucking them around Emily's chest and hands, then wrapped her in the blanket. Shadow pressed against her side, his body heat seeping into her. His eyes never left Daniel, as if daring him to promise this would work. Daniel lit a flare, its orange glow casting trembling shadows through the storm. He lifted it high, praying someone, anyone, would see it. But even if no one did, it gave them light, and sometimes light was enough. Emily stirred faintly, her lashes fluttering. Daniel bent close, whispering, "Stay with us, kiddo. Shadow found you. He doesn't quit. Neither can you." Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, as though giving her an order she had no choice but to obey. The girl's lips parted again, a whisper barely audible, "Dog." Daniel laughed hoarsely, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Yeah. That's him. That's Shadow. He's not letting you go." And in that moment, Daniel knew neither would he. The flare's glow hissed and cracked against the snow, a tiny defiance in the vast white void. Daniel held it high until his arm shook, but the blizzard devoured the light almost as fast as it came. If anyone saw it, they'd have to be close. Too close. He knelt again beside Emily, whose small form was bundled in the thermal blanket, her face pale, her lips tinged blue. Shadow pressed against her like a second blanket, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his nose tucked near her cheek to keep her warm. Daniel brushed snow from her hair with trembling fingers. "You're not slipping away. Not after we found you." The wind howled, mocking him. He scanned the frozen woods. Branches sagged under the weight of ice, some broken, some groaning like bones about to snap. Then his soldier's eyes caught what his desperation almost missed, a shallow drift beneath two fallen trees, forming a pocket of shelter. Crude, but better than the open storm. "Boy," he rasped, pointing. "There." Shadow barked once and bounded ahead, paws digging deep into the snow. He clawed at the drift, widening the gap until there was just enough space for a man, a child, and a dog. Daniel lifted Emily gently, every movement careful, and carried her into the hollow. He lowered himself against the inner wall of snow, pressing her against his chest. Shadow crawled in last, curling tightly around her other side. The storm outside screamed, but here it was muffled, dulled to a whisper. Emily stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but alive. Daniel bent close, whispering into her ear, "You're safe. Do you hear me? Safe." Her lips moved, barely audible. "Dog." Daniel felt a choked laugh escape him, his throat raw. "Yeah. He's right here." He guided her small hand to Shadow's fur. Her fingers curled weakly into the warmth, and Shadow's tail thumped once, slow and steady. Time dragged like an eternity. Daniel forced himself to stay awake, though every muscle screamed for rest. He pressed his body heat into Emily, adjusting the heat packs when they cooled, whispering stories about campfires, about sunny mornings, about anything that wasn't the storm. Shadow didn't rest either. His ears twitched at every groan of the trees, every distant snap in the woods. Once, he growled low, lips lifting as if the blizzard itself were trying to creep into their hollow. Only when Emily stirred did he quiet, licking her hand until she sighed and drifted again. The shepherd's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, amber flames in a world of white. Daniel met that gaze, whispering, "You're keeping her here." "I know it." Shadow blinked once, slow, steady, before laying his head across Emily's stomach, his weight anchoring her to the earth. At some point, minutes, maybe hours, the flare outside hissed into silence. Darkness reclaimed the hollow. The only sounds were Emily's shallow breaths, Daniel's labored ones, and the storm's dull roar. Daniel forced his eyes to stay open. He knew the truth, if he fell asleep, his body might not wake again. He had seen men freeze that way overseas, eyes closed for rest, never opening again. He leaned close to Emily, whispering fiercely, "You fight, kid. You fight harder than me. Harder than him." He nodded toward Shadow. "Because if you don't, he'll drag us both through the storm until you do." Emily made a faint sound, something between a sigh and a whimper, but her fingers twitched in Shadow's fur. Daniel exhaled, his chest tightening. That small twitch was hope. Then it happened. A sound beyond the storm. A faint, distant hum. Daniel's head jerked up, heart pounding. He strained his ears, holding his breath. The storm screamed, branches snapped, but beneath it, steady, unmistakable, the thrum of an engine. A snowmobile. Shadow's ears shot up. He barked once, sharp and explosive inside the hollow, then scrambled out into the storm. "Wait!" Daniel gasped, clutching Emily tighter. But Shadow wasn't abandoning them, he was leading the rescue. Through the swirling white, Daniel glimpsed his dog's dark form bounding toward the sound, barking over and over, defying the blizzard with every step. For the first time all night, Daniel let himself believe. Someone had heard the call. And Shadow was making sure they didn't pass by. The hollow trembled with Shadow's furious barks as he vanished into the storm. Daniel pressed Emily tighter, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The distant hum of the engine grew louder, then fainter, swallowed again by the wind. Come on, Daniel muttered, his voice cracking. He wanted to run after Shadow, but Emily's frail weight anchored him. If he left her for even a second, the cold would claim her. The snow outside erupted with noise, paws pounding, a dog's roar of defiance, and then, faint but clear, voices. Human voices. "Did you hear that? A dog, over there." Daniel's throat tightened. Shadow had found them. He shifted Emily higher in his arms and crawled toward the mouth of the hollow. Through the blur of white, shapes emerged, two figures on snowmobiles, their headlights slicing through the storm. Shadow bounded beside them, barking relentlessly, his body black against the flood of snow. He darted ahead, then back again, circling them until they turned toward Daniel's makeshift shelter. The rescuers slid from their vehicles, snowshoes crunching. One cupped his hands around his mouth. "Over here. We've got him." Daniel's knees nearly buckled. Relief slammed into him harder than the cold ever had. "Here," he shouted, raising a trembling arm. "She's alive, but she's freezing." The rescuers hurried forward, one dropping beside Emily with practiced hands. He peeled back the blanket, pressed fingers against her neck, and nodded. "Weak pulse, but she's fighting." The other man unclipped a radio, shouting into it through the wind, "We found them. One child, alive but hypothermic, prep evac now." Daniel sagged against the snow, his breath breaking in sharp bursts. For the first time since he'd seen those paw prints, he allowed himself to believe they would make it. Shadow padded back into the hollow, snow clinging to his coat, sides heaving from the run. His eyes locked onto Emily first, then Daniel. He whined softly, lowering his head, as if asking, "Did I do enough?" Daniel dropped a hand onto his neck, his fingers sinking into the icy fur. "You did everything. She's breathing because of you." Shadow's tail thumped once against the snow. The rescuers worked quickly. They wrapped Emily in a heated survival wrap, tucked chemical warmers against her chest and under her arms, and strapped her into a stretcher sled. Daniel hovered, refusing to let go of her hand. "She'll make it," one rescuer assured him. "You got to her in time." Daniel's voice cracked. "No." "He did." He nodded at Shadow, who stood watch with his chest puffed, ears high. Both men looked at the dog, and for a moment, even through the storm, awe filled their eyes. They began to trek back to the snowmobiles. The wind still screamed, but the sound of engines and human voices cut through it now. Shadow trotted ahead, clearing the path, stopping every few steps to check behind him, making sure no one fell behind. Daniel staggered through the snow, one hand on the sled that carried Emily, the other brushing Shadow's back whenever he came close. Every time he touched that wet fur, he reminded himself, this dog carried us through the impossible. At one point, a snowdrift collapsed across their path. The rescuers cursed, shoveling at it desperately. Shadow didn't wait, he bounded to the far side, barked, then dug furiously, carving a tunnel wide enough for them to push through. Daniel choked back a laugh. "You don't stop, do you?" The shepherd shook snow from his muzzle, eyes blazing with focus. Finally, headlights cut through the storm ahead, more rescuers, more sleds, more snowmobiles. The valley echoed with shouts of relief as they saw Emily's pale face wrapped in silver, her tiny chest rising and falling. "She's alive," someone cried. "Get her in the transport." Daniel stumbled after them as they loaded Emily into a heated vehicle, medics swarming to check her vitals. He didn't hear their words clearly, only the sound of her shallow breaths and the steady thump of Shadow's paws beside him. He sank to his knees in the snow, burying his face into the shepherd's neck. "We found her." "You found her." Shadow stood tall, pressing his head into Daniel's chest, his tail sweeping once in the snow. As the medics closed the doors and the engines roared, Daniel whispered a promise into Shadow's ear. "From now on, every step we take is because you never gave up." And though the storm still clawed at the valley, for the first time, it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt beaten. Because one soldier, one child, and one dog had proved that even the coldest night couldn't erase hope. The rescue team's engines roared against the silence of the storm, headlights slicing tunnels of light through the swirling snow. Emily was strapped into the back of a snow ambulance, an enclosed sled heated by generators. Medics crouched close, monitoring her faint pulse. Every few seconds, they spoke into radios, their voices clipped but urgent. Daniel walked beside the sled, his gloved hand gripping the side rail. He could have ridden inside, but he refused to leave her. His eyes never strayed far from the pale outline of her face, wrapped in silver foil and warmers. In Shadow, he never stopped moving. The shepherd trotted along the convoy, darting from front to back, his paws kicking up sprays of powder. Every time the headlights caught him, his eyes glowed amber, fierce and unwavering. Daniel called out hoarsely, "Stay close, boy." Shadow barked once in response, as if to say, "Closer than your own shadow." The path back was treacherous. Snowdrifts blocked their way, and the rescuers had to stop more than once to dig through walls of white. Each time, Shadow bounded ahead, sniffing, testing, barking when the snow gave way under his weight. He was their scout, their alarm, their compass. At one point, a snowmobile swerved dangerously, its treads losing grip on the ice. Daniel's heart seized. If it tipped, the sled would flip. But Shadow lunged, teeth clamping onto the driver's pant leg, dragging just enough to steady the machine until it found traction again. The rescuer glanced down in shock, then whispered through his scarf, "Good dog." Daniel managed a ragged laugh. "Good? He's better than all of us put together." Hours passed. The storm dulled but never stopped. Every gust cut through Daniel's bones, but he kept walking, one hand on the sled rail, the other brushing Shadow's damp fur whenever the dog came close. That touch was his tether to reality, a reminder they weren't alone in this frozen nightmare. Inside the sled, Emily stirred once, her lips parting, a faint murmur slipping out. "Dog." Daniel's heart clenched. He crouched low, pressing close to the window flap. "He's right here, Emily." "Shadow's right here." The shepherd's ears twitched at his name. He pressed himself against the sled side, his body brushing the panels as if to reassure her through the steel. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile before she drifted back into shallow sleep. Daniel swallowed hard, whispering, "You're bringing her back, boy." Step by step. The convoy pressed on, the outline of Miller's Creek barely visible in the distance. Smoke curled from a relief camp where generators hummed and floodlights pierced the night. civilization, warmth, safety. But the storm wasn't finished with them yet. A ridge of snow loomed across the trail, freshly collapsed, tall as a wall. The lead snowmobile skidded to a halt, headlights glaring against the mound. One rescuer cursed into his radio. "Roads blocked, gonna take hours to clear." Daniel's chest tightened. Hours were something Emily didn't have. Shadow leapt ahead, bounding up the drift, his claws carving into the ice. He barked sharply, turning to face them, tail stiff. He was saying what Daniel already knew: there's another way. Daniel followed, climbing halfway up the drift. From there, he could see it, a narrow pass cut by the wind through the trees, winding downhill toward the camp. Dangerous, steep, but shorter. He slid back down. There's a cut through the woods. Risky, but faster. The rescuers hesitated. With the sled? Daniel's voice hardened. With the sled. She won't last if we waste time. Shadow barked furiously, his paws already carving the first trail into the pass. The men exchanged a glance, then nodded. All right. We trust the dog. The descent was brutal. Snow machines strained against the steep grade, sleds rocking dangerously. Daniel ran alongside, one hand gripping the rail, the other braced against the sled to steady it. Shadow darted ahead, weaving through trees, barking warnings whenever branches sagged heavy with ice or drifts hit sudden drops. Once, a tree snapped overhead with a thunderous crack. Daniel shoved against the sled, shouting, "Move!" Shadow barked, leaping sideways, guiding them out of the path just as the trunk crashed across the trail. Snow exploded, branches splintered, but the convoy was already past, alive because of seconds. The rescuers shouted over the roar, voices shaking. "That dog just saved all of us." Daniel gritted his teeth, eyes locked on Shadow's bounding form. He's been doing it all night. At last, the trees thinned. Floodlights glowed through the storm ahead. The camp. Cheers erupted from the rescuers. Some raised fists, others hooped into the wind. But Daniel only looked at the sled, and at the shepherd who had guided them every step. Emily stirred again, her lips moving faintly. This time, a word slipped clear: Shadow. The dog's ears pricked. He slowed his run, pressing close to the sled, his muzzle brushing its side. Her tiny hand shifted beneath the blanket, reaching weakly. Daniel's throat tightened. "She's reaching for you, boy." Shadow pressed harder against the sled, his eyes glowing in the light. And though she couldn't see him through the steel, her hand stilled, as if she felt him anyway. They broke through the final drift into the camp. Floodlights bathed the convoy in gold, volunteers rushing to meet them, blankets and stretchers in hand. The storm still howled, but it no longer mattered. They had made it. Because Shadow had never let them fall. The convoy broke through the final drift and rolled into the relief camp. Floodlights blazed overhead, turning the snow into gold, and generators rumbled like distant thunder. Volunteers in heavy coats ran forward, pulling sled doors open, rushing to meet the survivors. Daniel stumbled after the medics carrying Emily into the warmth of the main tent. Heat blasted from propane heaters, washing the sting from his frozen skin. The smell of coffee, wood smoke, and antiseptic filled the air, strange comforts after hours of nothing but ice and silence. Emily was lowered onto a cot. Medics swarmed her, stripping away the frozen blanket, checking her pulse, warming her skin with heated pads. Daniel hovered at the edge, his fists clenched, every muscle tense. Pulse is weak, but steady. She's responding to the heat packs. She'll make it. Those words cracked the weight crushing Daniel's chest. He bowed his head, sucking in a breath so sharp it burned. And then he felt a wet nose press against his hand. Shadow. The shepherd stood at his side, soaked to the bone, his fur stiff with ice. Yet his eyes blazed, watching Emily, tail twitching with every faint breath she took. Daniel sank to one knee, pulling the dog into a rough embrace. "You did it, boy," he whispered into the damp fur. "You carried her through." Shadow's chest rumbled with a low, content growl, his body leaning into Daniel's weight. Word spread fast. Survivors gathered near the tent's flap, whispering about the shepherd who had led the rescuers, who had found the girl beneath the snow. A boy stepped closer, clutching a borrowed blanket, his eyes wide. "That's him," he said to his mother. "That's the dog who saved her." Others nodded. Some pressed hands to their mouths, tears welling. The story moved quicker than the storm ever had, paw prints in the snow, a hand beneath the ice, a soldier and his dog refusing to quit. Soon the crowd grew, not gawking, but watching in reverence. Shadow shifted uneasily, ears twitching, but Daniel placed a steadying hand on his back. "They're not staring, partner," he murmured. "They're thanking you." Hours passed. The blizzard softened into a gentle snowfall, flakes drifting lazily past the floodlights. Inside the camp, cots lined the tent, each filled with storm survivors. Families reunited, sharing blankets, holding hands. Someone lit a barrel fire outside, and people gathered around it, shivering but alive. Daniel sat near Emily's cot, his fatigue finally catching up to him. He hadn't eaten, hadn't rested, but his eyes refused to leave her. She lay bundled in blankets, color slowly returning to her cheeks, her breaths deeper now. At her side, Shadow stretched across the floor, his head resting against the cot, his amber eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Emily stirred, her lashes fluttering. She whispered a single word, soft but clear, "Dog." Shadow's ears pricked. He lifted his head and nudged her hand gently with his nose. Her tiny fingers curled weakly into his fur. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "He never left you." "Not once." As night deepened, the relief camp became a haven of warmth. Survivors sat around the barrel fires, trading stories of what they'd lost, but also of what they'd kept. A woman with bandaged hands whispered, "That dog, he found her." Another man nodded, saying, "He barked until the rescuers followed him." Every story circled back to the shepherd. One of the rescuers approached Daniel, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand. "We've seen a lot of storms," the man said, shaking his head. "But I've never seen anything like your dog tonight. He's the reason we didn't lose her." Daniel accepted the mug with trembling hands. He looked down at Shadow, who sat pressed against Emily's cot, tail thumping once in quiet pride. "He's the reason we didn't lose any of us." Later, when the fire outside roared higher, Daniel carried Emily, still bundled in blankets, to sit near it. She clung to him weakly, her head resting against his shoulder. Shadow walked at their side, pacing like a guard on patrol. As they sat by the flames, Emily stirred again, opening her eyes enough to see the shepherd curled at her feet. Her lips trembled into a smile. "You found me," she whispered. Daniel's throat tightened. He stroked her hair gently. "No. He found you." The firelight danced in Shadow's eyes, glowing like embers in the night. Around the circle, survivors fell silent, watching the three of them, soldier, child, and dog, framed by fire and snow. In that moment, the storm seemed far away, and the night belonged only to the warmth of survival. The blizzard finally broke its grip in the darkest hours before dawn. By the time the horizon began to pale, the world outside the relief camp was quiet, snow still blanketed everything in thick drifts, but the wind had stilled, the sky stretched clear, and stars blinked faintly above the broken town. Inside the camp, the survivors stirred. For the first time in days, the only sounds were the crackle of fires, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional hiss of a generator. Daniel hadn't moved all night. He sat slouched on a bench inside the tent, Emily nestled beneath his coat, breathing steady at last. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound, every shuffle, every faint cry from another cot. He hadn't allowed himself to sleep, he was still guarding, even now. The flap of the tent lifted, and sunlight spilled through, pale gold on the snow. Gasps rippled through the shelter as survivors turned their faces toward it. After endless white darkness, the dawn felt like a miracle. Daniel nudged Emily gently. "Look, kiddo," he whispered. "Morning made it." Her eyes fluttered open, weak but curious. She blinked at the light and whispered, "Pretty." Shadow raised his head, amber eyes gleaming in the sun. He stood, stretched, and padded toward the opening. His paws sank into the snow, but he walked with slow dignity, as though he carried the dawn on his shoulders. The survivors followed him with their eyes. Some even rose, stepping outside barefoot in the snow, just to stand under the new light with him. The camp transformed in the sunrise. Children who had been crying the night before now chased one another in the snow, wrapped in oversized coats. Parents who had clung to silence now whispered words of hope. Volunteers passed steaming mugs of soup, their faces softer, less haunted. And through it all, Shadow roamed. He padded between groups, accepting quiet strokes of gratitude, pressing his head against trembling hands, curling beside those who couldn't stand yet. Wherever he went, voices lowered, shoulders eased. Daniel watched, his chest tightening with pride. He murmured to Emily, "See? He doesn't just guard. He heals." The girl clung to her worn doll, her lips trembling into a faint smile. "He found me." Daniel kissed her hair. "He'll keep finding you. Always." Later, a group of rescuers gathered near the fire barrel. They spoke quietly, but Daniel caught their words. "That dog's the reason she's here. I've never seen instincts like that. Doesn't matter how many storms I've worked, without him, we'd have lost half of them." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but certain. "He's more than a dog. He's my partner. And he saved all of us." The rescuers nodded, their eyes following Shadow as he curled protectively around Emily's cot once more. One muttered almost reverently, "Guardian angel in fur." As the morning grew brighter, the camp came alive with rebuilding. Volunteers shoveled paths between tents, families salvaged belongings, and survivors began planning where to go once the snow cleared. Yet through the bustle, Shadow never left Emily's side for long. Even when other children tried to coax him away, he returned, pressing his body against her, his eyes scanning the horizon. Emily looked up at Daniel, her voice still faint but certain. "He's staying with me forever, right?" Daniel met Shadow's gaze, steady, loyal, unbreakable. He smiled softly. "As long as there's breath in him. And in me." Shadow thumped his tail once, as if sealing the promise himself. That night, when the fires dimmed and the stars glowed brighter, Daniel sat outside the tent with Shadow at his side. The snow sparkled under the moonlight, clean and untouched. He looked at his partner, voice quiet. "You carried us through the coldest night I've ever known. You found her when I couldn't. You reminded me why I still fight." Shadow turned his head, pressing his muzzle into Daniel's hand. His amber eyes reflected the starlight, fierce yet gentle. Daniel exhaled, his chest heavy with gratitude. "You're not just my dog. You're the reason hope made it through the storm." And in that silent, frozen world, Shadow's steady presence was louder than any roar of blizzard had ever been. By mid-morning, the relief camp had settled into a fragile rhythm. Volunteers moved between tents with clipboards and blankets, handing out soup and ration packs. Children huddled near the fire barrels, their laughter breaking through the air like fragile glass. For the first time since the storm began, the sound of life was louder than the memory of wind. But whenever the conversations turned to what they had endured, one name always surfaced. Shadow. It began quietly. A woman sat near the fire, hands wrapped in gauze, whispering to the man beside her. That dog barked until they followed him. If he hadn't, her voice cracked, and she pressed her palms to her eyes. We wouldn't be here. Nearby, a boy clutched his father's arm. He pulled Grandpa out of the water. I saw it. He grabbed his coat and wouldn't let go. Soon, more voices joined in. Each story spilled into the next, threads weaving into a tapestry of survival. The river nearly swallowed me, but he dragged me back. He led us through the trees when we couldn't see anything. He never stopped, not once. Not even when he was freezing. People who had lost everything now found comfort in repeating the same truth. They had been saved by a soldier and his dog. Daniel listened from the edge of the circle, Emily bundled in his coat on his lap. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but she stirred each time someone spoke Shadow's name, as if her heart refused to rest without hearing it. At his feet, the shepherd lay stretched across the snow, paws curled beneath him. His fur was still damp, his sides rising and falling in steady rhythm, but his eyes flicked open whenever anyone passed too close to Emily. Even in exhaustion, he guarded. Daniel stroked his neck. Hear that, boy? They'll never forget you. Shadow's tail brushed once against the ground, a faint acknowledgement. By afternoon, the stories had turned into something else, gratitude. Survivors approached Daniel one by one, asking if they could touch Shadow, if they could thank him. The shepherd endured it patiently, children wrapping their arms around his neck, elders pressing trembling hands to his head, teenagers whispering shy thank yous. Emily, still wrapped in Daniel's coat, watched with wide eyes. They all know him now. Daniel smiled faintly. They always will. One rescuer knelt before Shadow, removing his gloves. I've worked storms 10 years. I've seen brave men, strong machines, but I've never seen anything like this. He rubbed the shepherd's chest, voice thick. He's the reason we're all alive. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to argue that it had been teamwork, desperation, luck, but the truth was undeniable. Shadow had carried them where no human could. That evening, the camp gathered around the largest fire. Smoke curled into the night sky, sparks leaping upward like stars. Survivors shared pieces of bread, mugs of hot broth, even laughter. But when the firelight flickered across Shadow, lying with Emily's hand buried in his fur, the crowd fell into reverent silence. A young girl whispered, "Tell it again." How he found her. And so Daniel told it. His voice was rough, low, but it carried. He spoke of paw prints in the snow, of Shadow's furious barking, of a tiny hand beneath the ice. He told them how the shepherd had never quit, not when the storm tried to bury them, not when the cold tried to steal them, not when the night tried to erase every trace of hope. When he finished, the fire popped loudly, breaking the stillness. An old man wiped his eyes. The storm will be remembered. But so will the dog who beat it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the circle. For the survivors of Miller's Creek, the story of Shadow had become more than a tale. It was proof that courage could outlast even the cruelest night. Later, when the crowd dispersed, Daniel sat close to the embers with Emily curled against him. She stirred once, her lips forming a whisper. Dog stayed. Daniel kissed her hair. Yeah, kiddo. He stayed. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the last light of the fire. He pressed his muzzle against Emily's side, sealing the truth with a gesture more powerful than words. And in that moment, Daniel realized the storm hadn't just left scars, it had left a legend. The morning after the storm was unlike any the valley had ever seen. The skies had cleared, pale blue stretching over a world of snow that glittered like diamonds in the sun. Helicopters thudded overhead, supply trucks rumbled into the camp, and journalists spilled out with cameras slung across their chests. They came for the story. But what they found was something more. A soldier. A child. And a German shepherd who had refused to let the storm win. The first reporter approached Daniel hesitantly, microphone trembling in her mittened hand. "Sir, we've been told your dog led rescuers through the storm. That he found the missing girl." Daniel's eyes went to Emily, still bundled in blankets on the cot, her hand buried in Shadow's fur. The shepherd sat pressed against her side, ears twitching, eyes steady. "Not just led," Daniel said quietly. "He carried all of us. Every step of the way." The reporter blinked, then crouched lower, turning her camera toward the dog. Shadow's amber eyes reflected the sunlight, glowing as if lit from within. Emily stirred, murmuring "Shadow," in her small, fragile voice. And in that moment, the story was no longer just words, it was alive. By midday, the camp buzzed with officials, photographers, and rescuers recounting their versions of the night. Each story circled back to the shepherd. He barked until we followed him through the woods. He bit down on the old man's coat and dragged him out. He cleared the trail when the snowdrifts blocked the machines. One rescuer shook his head in disbelief. "That dog was the reason we didn't write death reports this morning." The cameras captured it all, Shadow curled protectively around Emily, Shadow pacing the camp's edge like a guard, Shadow pressing his head into Daniel's chest as though the night had never ended. Headlines began to spread within hours. "The dog who beat the blizzard." "Shadow, the guardian of Miller's Creek." When all hope froze, one shepherd didn't. Daniel wasn't one for the spotlight. But he sat through the interviews, Emily on his lap, Shadow at his feet, because the world deserved to know the truth. "He's not just my partner," Daniel told them. "He's the reason that child's alive. The reason we all are." Emily, still weak but awake, leaned into the microphone with her small, cracked voice. "He found me." The camp went silent. Reporters lowered their cameras, volunteers wiped at their eyes, even the hard-faced rescuers cleared their throats and looked away. Shadow only blinked, laying his head across Emily's knees, as if to say, "It was nothing. Just my duty." Later that evening, when the officials gathered survivors for transport to safer shelters, Shadow once again trotted beside every step. Children who had once been strangers now reached out to touch him, whispering their thanks. Parents smiled through tears, murmuring blessings under their breath. Daniel walked behind them all, watching the shepherd guide the crowd without being told, his chest swelling with pride. When they boarded the transport trucks, the commander clasped Daniel's hand firmly. "You've seen storms before, soldier. But I don't think you've ever fought one with a partner like that." Daniel glanced at Shadow, who sat at Emily's feet in the truck bed, fur glowing in the last streaks of sunset. His lips curved faintly. "No. And I never will again." That night, as the trucks rumbled away from the wreckage of Miller's Creek, the world outside was quiet, only snow and silence, no more howling wind. Inside the truck, survivors huddled together, some sleeping, some staring out the windows in silence. Shadow sat tall, ears forward, eyes fixed on the horizon. Emily leaned against him, her doll clutched tight, her face finally peaceful. Daniel placed a hand on the shepherd's back, whispering so only he could hear, "You're not just a hero, boy. You're hope itself." And as the truck carried them into a future no longer claimed by the storm, the legend of Shadow had already begun to spread, etched into the hearts of every survivor, every rescuer, and every life saved by paw prints in the snow. Weeks passed, but the memory of the storm never left Miller's Creek. The town was scarred, houses shattered, trees splintered, roads erased beneath mountains of ice. Yet amid the destruction, something else had taken root. Hope. It wasn't in the bricks or the timber. It was in the stories people carried, whispered by firelight and printed in newspapers across the country. The story of a soldier, a child, and a German shepherd named Shadow. In the relief shelter, Emily's laughter began to return. Her cheeks, once pale as snow, bloomed with color again. She rarely left Shadow's side. Wherever the shepherd lay, she curled beside him, her small doll pressed between them. Volunteers often smiled when they passed, whispering, "The girl who lived because the dog never gave up." Daniel kept close too, though his role was quieter. He spoke little of his own endurance, his ribs still aching from the storm. Instead, he told everyone who asked the same thing, "It wasn't me. It was him." Reporters couldn't get enough. Headlines screamed, "Paw Prints to Salvation. The dog who carried hope through the storm. Shadow, the guardian who wouldn't let go." Pictures of Shadow, first still damp and eyes burning with steady fire, spread across television screens and front pages. Letters poured into the camp, children mailing drawings of paw prints, veterans writing about loyalty, families sending collars and treats. But none of it mattered to Shadow. He only cared that Emily was warm, that Daniel was near, and that every night, when the generators dimmed, he could press his head against their hands and know his family was safe. One evening, after the survivors had been relocated to safer housing, Daniel walked with Emily and Shadow to the edge of the valley. Snow still clung stubbornly to the ground, but the sun was brighter now, and the air smelled faintly of thaw. Emily tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Will the storm come back?" Daniel crouched, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Storms always come back, kiddo. But so does morning. And when it does, we face it." He glanced at Shadow, whose tail swept across the snow. "Together." Emily nodded solemnly, then pressed her cheek against Shadow's head. "I wasn't scared when he was there." Daniel's throat tightened. He knew the truth of her words. He hadn't been fearless that night, but he hadn't been alone either. The town rebuilt slowly, each day marked not just by labor, but by remembrance. In the schoolyard, children played a game they called Follow the Paw Prints. In the church, sermons spoke of loyalty, courage, and a shepherd who showed what it meant to never abandon hope. Eventually, a small stone was placed near the rebuilt bridge where so much had been lost. On it was etched a simple inscription: "To Shadow, who found us when all was lost." Daniel stood there with Emily on one side and Shadow on the other, his chest tight as he read the words aloud. The shepherd sniffed the stone once, then sat proudly, as if he understood. That night, Daniel wrote in his journal by firelight. "The world will forget the cold. They'll forget the howling wind. But they'll never forget the paw prints in the snow. Because those prints didn't just lead to a child. They led to hope. They led to tomorrow." Shadow lifted his head from Emily's lap, amber eyes meeting Daniel's across the fire. And Daniel smiled softly, whispering, "You've left more than tracks in the snow, boy. You've left them in every heart that knows your name." When the next storm came, weeks later, lighter, less cruel, the town did not tremble as it once had. Neighbors checked on each other, families opened doors, and children pressed their hands into the snow to make prints of their own. And always, Shadow was there. The shepherd who had faced the blizzard. The guardian who had refused to let go. The legend who proved that even in the coldest night, loyalty could burn brighter than any fire. Because long after the winds had faded, one truth remained. Storms may erase roads, houses, and landmarks. But paw prints never fade.